afternoon, everyone. My name is Erica George. It is my honor to direct the Tanner Humanities Center. I'm the professor of law, the Samuel D. Thurman Professor of Law at the S.J. Quinney College of Law. And today, it is my pleasure to welcome one of our valued Tanner Humanities Research Fellows. We are joined today by Nkenna Onwuzuruoha, who practiced with me earlier today. Nkenna was born in New Orleans, which is where my family hails from as well. She was born to two Nigerian parents and raised in Marietta, Georgia. She has a first-hand experience as a first-generation American. She received her bachelor's in French and in comparative literature from the University of Chicago, also my undergraduate alma mater. And she went on to receive a master's in European literatures from the University of Bristol in the UK. She then moved to Salt Lake City over 10 years ago to serve as an AmeriCorps Vista volunteer for the Salt Lake Community College Community Writing Center. Now she's with us. She's currently a PhD candidate in Writing and Rhetoric Studies at the University of Utah. She's a Tanner Humanities Center graduate research member, and she's a member of the University of Utah's African American Doctoral Scholars Initiative program. She taught first-year writing and social justice courses at the U, at Salt Lake Community College, and at Westminster College. This isn't in the bio, but I know she's been celebrated by the YWCA, and she does immeasurable amounts of good in our community and community work. So she is a PhD candidate here, and she's been working in social justice, not only here and also at Westminster College. Today, she's going to talk to you about her doctoral project. This is one part of a very interesting in-depth project. It's a study that explores the relationship between the Black Student Union at the San Francisco State University and its college newspaper, the Gator Incident. It's during the height of the Black Power movements that she situates this conflict, and she conducts a close rhetorical analysis of the publication, a microhistory of the incident from 1966 to 1968, examining the language, violence, and constructs of power. By delving into the past, her work provides greater understanding for contemporary activism and US experiences and the constant resurgences of racial unrest that we've seen. The title of her paper is Fighting Words with Fists. And with no further ado, I give you Nkenna. We will be opening for Q&A from half our virtual community. Thank you for joining us here, and welcome to the community in the room. And Nkenna, thank you. It's been wonderful to have you as part of our community this year.
Hi everyone, thank you all for attending my work in progress. I'm going to share my screen with you all real quick. Let's see here. Oh, that's not it. All right, let me start from the beginning and that'll be better.
I think afterwards during the Q&A, we're going to have people go up and ask questions there so that the Zoomers can hear it as well.
Yeah.
So just prepare for being on camera.
Okay, let's see here. I think my presentation is loading. Technical difficulties here. So just... Okay, let's see. I'm still thinking about it. All right, cool. All right, slideshow. Okay, from the beginning. Yay. Okay, beautiful. Okay, we've conquered that. So, all right, again, thank you all for attending my work in progress, be it in person or over Zoom. This is the first crack at my dissertation chapter. So I've condensed a lot of what I've written in the chapter itself to major themes and ideas that I want to present to you today in this talk. Since this is truly a work in progress, I am greatly looking forward to your impressions your suggestions and feedback. So let's begin. There you go. Okay, so on November 6, 1967, a group of young Black men entered the newsroom of San Francisco State College's college campus paper, The Gator. No one invited them. Many believe the visitors were members of the Black Student Union, the BSU. Once inside, they entered editor Jim Basco's office, where a physical altercation between the two parties began. Some assailed Basco, while others wrecked the home of the student paper. Men flung papers around the floor, damaged office equipment, and allegedly barred staff from entering Basco's office or leaving the newsroom. Those who tried to aid Basco to prevent further destruction to the space were attacked. According to the article, The Gator released the next day, Basco, captured on the ground with papers scattered around him, was taken to an on-campus medical facility to tend to his injuries. Other Gator staff and associates sustained wounds and bruises. Journalism instructor Lynn Ludlow was in the middle of a scuffle as seen in the Gator front page photo. He incurred a broken finger before everyone had laid their fists down. The BSU faced heavy criticism during this time. Basco rallied his readers against the Black Student Union with a scathing editor's death piece and a letter to the Carnegie Foundation requesting to freeze funds for the BSU's community and campus programming. His letter, op-eds by victims of the attack, the letters of the editor showed that many did not believe the BSU statement that it was not involved. Moreover, they saw the BSU as aligned with a militant and segregationist stance, closely associated with the Black Panther Party of Self-Defense. Many found the Black men culpable for the brawl, and San Francisco State's administration swiftly decided to suspend 6 students without holding a hearing first. One campus student news organization rose from the turmoil, movements against political suspensions, otherwise known as MAPS, and argued that the administration's line of action did not adhere to due process. The student suspensions, along with suspensions of open process editor Blair Paltridge and Jefferson Poland, led to a protest that shut down the campus for a day and a month after the Gator incident. So for a month after the Gator incident. So this work in progress analyzes Basco's article on the Gator incident and the pieces written by the campus community that the Gator published in the letter to the editor's section. Basco and his staff, because of their position, had the power to create, control, and disseminate information that readers received and shape the conscious and unconscious biases. Let me just move this out of the way for folks. There you go. Okay. The Gator is a site that mirrored the power differentials often seen in public discourses. For example, one speaker having more leeway to express their thoughts clearly, someone with more power deciding whose discourse is recognized within a public forum, and the performance of objectivity when moderating conversations. In this chapter, I examine the BSU and the Gator's relationship in a span of a little over a month. My analysis best responds to 2 research questions. Research question 1, what depictions of the actors involved in the Gator incident appeared in the publication? Research question 2, how did those writing on the Gator incident shape the discourse on the tactics the actors used to gain or regain power? I framed the Gator incident as a critical incident which Orly Shapiro-Lashinsky introduces in her research on teaching practices, but can apply to how undesirable situations affect campuses. The term advanced into a theory and technique that addresses an event or situation which marked a significant turning point or change in a life of a person in some social phenomenon. Leading up to the Gator incident, a few published reports on the BSU's events and activities informed the rhetoric seen in the editorials and letters to editor in the fight's aftermath. In particular, they helped understand the depictions cast by both the Gator as a group of white men and a news publishing entity, and the Black men with undoubtedly close ties to the Black Student Union. Nearly all the Gator issues have been stored on San Francisco State's digital database and are free and accessible to the public. I investigated all Gator publications from 1966 to 1968, totaling 376 issues. I chose to interpret my data by closely examining what was written about the incident by the San Francisco State campus community who experienced it firsthand. These actors' words have power. Moreover, discourse, especially in student newspapers, reflects the climate on college campuses that make high-stakes situations better or worse for everyone involved. The Gator incident was an anchor event exposing how news coverage on San Francisco State's Black student activism movement was filtered through a white lens using white discourse and ideologies. The practice maintained an inequitable share of power over the public depiction and dominant narrative of one of the campus's most vulnerable populations. The following section will analyze pieces that Vasco and other campus community members published in the student paper days after the fight, looking explicitly for our police language that shaped the public opinions of the BSU and Black activism. So now I will move on to Vasco's response. Okay, the Gator did not use a lot of its space to provide commentary or insight on the Gator incident from those who were there. The Gator, after its article about the Gator incident, continued to follow how due process was playing out for the 6 students who were identified, suspended, and arrested. Its coverage tended to be a straightforward report of the aftermath, and the Gator avoided criticizing or aggrandizing the role each party played in the fight. San Francisco State's administration was the only entity that could punish the BSU through expulsion or suspension. Then the administrators had already complied with the police to have the students arrested and charged with assault. On November 16th, when there was finally a hearing to learn more about what transpired 10 days earlier, several staff members gave their testimony. However, the Gator reported the next day that many staff members felt that the hearing process was mismanaged and disorganized. Jim Vasco goes directly after the Black Student Union in his title of his taunt, "Oh, not the BSU," implies. The Gator chronicled the turmoil as the Associated Student Legislature accusation of the BSU was that the BSU was a racist organization went to the state legislature. In May, the Gator also reported on the BSU's fight for more program funding. Knowing the coverage had diminished from the headlines the BSU was making during the spring and summer of 1967, Vasco started his editorial by writing that the BSU had largely been ignored fall semester. He then follows a rhetorical strategy for gaining control by reframing the Gator incident with a public abnegation of the BSU. Vasco portrays the organization as liars when they tried to state to the public that they had no involvement in the altercation. The BSU adheres to racist ideologies, preaches hate, and is violent enough to harm anyone it scorns. Vasco makes a point of implying that neither the Gator nor the campus is racist or anti-Negro. Vasco takes drastic action against the BSU in his editorial. He states that no longer will the BSU be allowed to charge admission for on-campus activities. Moreover, the Gator took initial steps yesterday in the form of a letter to the Carnegie Foundation to block the issuance of a grant between $100,000 to $250,000 intended for service programs for San Francisco State. Some letters to the editor would refer to this form of retribution, oftentimes unfavorably. It would eventually work to undo the picture painted by the Gator, many letters to the editor, and outside publications that Vasco fully deserve their pity. Vasco additionally calls for collective organizing. However, it does not involve demonstrating on the to halt the daily flow of campus activities that he has rebuffed in his editorials that groups like Organization of Student Employees, OSE, or the BSU are guilty of committing. It is also different from the policymaking sin in the Academic Senate's new resolution to call for a definition of campus rules and customs and asks that they be made binding on all segments of the campus community and be approved and enforced. While the group intended to deter behavior, so the Academic Senate, Vasco's strategy was to punish it. Vasco calls for the students and the organization's outraged by the incident to sign a petition for the college administration to kick the BSU off campus. He had decided a course of action as a self-imposed arbitrator and was relying on the Gators' power as an institutional representative to persuade San Francisco State to exact his decision. Basco, at the end of his editorial, facetiously thanks the BSU. Though he starts his letter by addressing how fearful the campus community is of the organization, he thanks it for showing its true nature. He writes, "Finally, the BSU deserves some kind of thanks for alerting us to the type of group it is." Basco treats the Gator incident as a revelatory act that should cement the reputation of the BSU as an organization. He indexes the student activist organization as fearful, violent, and destructive. Basco seemingly abandoned his campaign against the BSU when the Board of Publication, so the BOP, voted on whether to suspend him as a Gator editor. One extra vote in favor of keeping Basco allowed him to retain his position at the Gator until February 1968, when he chose to step down. Shortly after, the Gator shifted from portraying the BSU as antagonists to victims in the coverage of campus unrest, so much so that the newly instated president, S.I. Hayakawa, attempted to shut the paper down twice in 1969. Though Basco was the audience for the series of letters to the editor that follow the Gator incident, the many exigencies for composing them speak to a far larger discourse community. Now I will introduce a selection of letters to the editor. There you go. Writers seek new discursive modes to express ideas in their unique style that contribute to the course of thoughts on a particular issue. Some students writing into the Gator on the newsroom brawl chose the rhetorical strategy of direct address to be in immediate conversation with the interlocutors that they may have never gotten a chance to encounter. They use information available to provide a rebuttal to a message or react to events. For example, Basco received letters from the campus community who have moved beyond the Dear Editor salutation to show, rather than tell Basco, that he is whom the letter concerns. Albert Duro, whom we'll discuss later, does this simply by addressing his letter to the so-called Gator editor. Duro is not afraid to be confrontational and disrupt the standard textual conventions and tone that readers expect. The rest use the Dear Editor or editor : template and the second person you. Marcia Salner sees Basco's letter to the Carnegie Foundation as the writing of a, quote, a little boy who after being bullied on the playground wants to set fire to the school, unquote. She poses 4 questions to Basco. Are your bruises really worth a $500,000 grant from Carnegie? Have you asked yourself why you got your head bashed? How much does it take to confront you with the issues involved? Another head bashing? The question is why? Why? A lot of people know the answer. Why don't you? Salner conveys concisely a demeaning, unsympathetic, angsty tone with her use of you and your. Jean Levico also directs her letter to Basco using you and your, but opts for a less abrasive delivery. Like Salner, she writes a short piece of a little over 100 words to criticize Basco for sending the Carnegie letter. Levico ends by admitting, it is my hope that you will publicly change your position on the Carnegie grant. The line is direct in its address to Basco, but indirect in a suitable course of action. It is a coy request for Basco to retract his letter that does not match the strong language of irresponsible, irrational, and vindictive used to admonish Basco at the beginning of her letter. 2 letters you've used to side with Basco and his team. Larry Hoey describes the attack of the Gators newsroom as cowardly. He starts off his letter to Basco with the word you, followed by an enthusiastic offer of support. Hoey, Basco, and the rest of the nation live in a period of uncertainty as the Vietnam War and the anti-war movement equally persist. Hoey, a college student, role-plays as an eager young man ready to enlist to fight for his country with his very first sentence to Basco. You have my support against those who designate themselves as by their actions as enemy forces, exclamation point. Hoey later uses invasion to describe the brawl that transpired in the Gator office. He, as excited as Hoey seems to lend his support, he starts off his concluding paragraph with, "I am not advocating retaliation." They're using very militaristic language. Hoey sees encouraging violence and retaliation as one and the same. Those writing upset about the possible repercussions of Vasco's Carnegie letter, like Levico and Salner, would disagree. But nonetheless, readers soon understand that Hoey would like to offer nothing more than moral support. Okay. Eulau shows the limits of his liberalism in his letter, thus falling under the delineation of those who claim to be progressives, but are appalled by the BSU's actions. This is a point other more politically radical writers I've yet to discuss will point out. He starts his letter by directly addressing Vasco using I statements and the anaphoric phrase, "I do not believe." Eulau wants to put himself in opposition to Vasco's conservative beliefs. He sees himself as standing for a healthy left-leaning discourse and activism that will contribute to the campus community's well-being and harmony. Student workers deserve the wage increase to $2.25 an hour. The student union is doing its job well and does not need restructuring. The community service projects should receive the Carnegie funds. Eulau uses you to do what Marcia Salner asked Vasco to do in her letter, to figure out what everyone else knows, why he received the head bashing, quote unquote, from the BSU. Eulau claims that he knows the motives that Salner asked Vasco to investigate when he explains, "I was one of the few white persons who attended the meeting of the first BSU after the well-planned attack on your office. They will not, as a group, apologize for the beatings you and your staff received in the Gator offices on campus. If they wanted to get just you, they would have gotten you alone, but they wanted publicity." Eulau uses a direct address in a way that momentarily closes off discourse. The letter becomes a conversation between Eulau and Vasco, where the former explains the harsh realities. Vasco was merely a pawn in the BSU's larger agenda for the spotlight. The latter half of the letter takes a sharp and bitter turn from seeing Vasco as someone he is in opposition to ideologically to villainizing the BSU. So Gator and sympathizers like Eulau denounce white radicals for not setting limits to how far their support of the Black liberation movement will go. Eulau paints himself as a reform liberal. He is not willing to go to the extremes of violence to achieve the aims of white or Black progressives. White liberals hold a unique space in the condemnatory rhetoric that takes place in the discursive side of the Gator letters editor. As soon as a Black person resorts to tactics that shift the power differentials that have long existed in society, there's a public outcry to disavow these means to achieve a goal. This phenomenon is an active masking of the histories that show the world that violence has always been an effective means when the dominant group uses it against marginalized people who have done more enduring and resisting violence and employing it. As December 6th, student protests co-organized by the Movement Against Political Suspension, so MAPS, and the BSU is looming, James R. Kreider takes a diplomatic approach, trying to convince the two groups that sitting college president John Summerskill is not the enemy. Kreider has observed the emotional strain put on Summerskill by racial unrest at San Francisco State. He bestows an identity of liberal onto the college president, but one who has set boundaries concerning what he's willing to do or state in the name of progress. Summerskill embodies the apolitical white liberal who deplores violence. Kreider sees the college president as a man the peace groups can work with. Summerskill has said he supports civil rights. It is not the BSU that jeopardizes the peace on campus as much as the silent ones, quote unquote. They sit on the fence instead of turning towards conservatism to return the campus to the status quo. They could also adopt a by any means necessary approach to seeing to the success of the Black liberation movement. Kreider directs his disdain towards silent ones in his direct address. In his letter, he writes, "And the silent ones, you amaze me the most. You amaze me most of all. To the silent ones, I say, if you don't back up administrators of Summerskill's quality we are going to lose these men. We can't afford to lose them. Summer School juggles the interest convergence occurring at the school so well that Crider calls for the ones who have held back the response to favor an administration the school may lose if they are resigned to stay on top of the fence. Alan Kornfeld attacks the radical left who have decided to support the BSU wholeheartedly in his letter published a day after the December 6th protests. He claims that the liberal movement on campus is scarred with bitter hatred and unreasoning prejudice. He goes into rebuking their support for what he sees as the cowardly attack on the Gator staff. His direct address to the radical left comes near the end of his letter, attempting to deliver a soul-crushing message to its efforts towards revolution as futile. He writes, "Tone down your extremism, you would-be revolutionary heroes, because you will never beat whatever you call the establishment. I hope the deep schism you have carved in liberalia doesn't doom us all. The use of you in this short passage acts as a strong finger pointing. Kornfeld wants each member of the radical left to know that they have caused nothing but discord and harshly divisive politics to dictate the racial climate on campus. He uses accusatory rhetoric to paint a dystopic future where the divide between left and right ideologies was even wider to make peace an impossible dream. Conversely, the BSU supporters call out white liberals for not speaking publicly on how white violence, be it rhetorical or bodily, is at the root of injustice in American society. Their outrage over white liberal silence unites the two political polarized groups writing in the letters to the editor section. Albert Duro section rebukes those who lament the BSU's violent tactics and not the Gators' far more destructive form of verbal violence, quote unquote. He addresses the hypocritical, self-righteous students who fashion themselves liberals and radicals but are shocked by the Black students' actions. Before reminding them of the atrocities committed during the Holocaust and the Vietnam War to uphold white supremacy, he calls into question their self-proclaimed open-mindedness. He sees their need to dictate what measures are appropriate in the fight for Black liberation and racial equality, and their offer of conditional support. Mark Hansen concurs with Duro and makes the same argument for a range of white society members, including white students, staff, administrators, and white racists, who fail to organize the many forms of violence in America that Black people endure. Like Duro, Mark Hansen does not leave out white progressives. He writes, "Because we choose to call ourselves white radicals or white liberals does not change in the least the fact of our complicity in the numberless acts of physical, moral, and psychological violence that Black people on this campus and off are forced to put up with every day of every year." Here, Hansen uses direct address to condemn white people for their supposed support of racial progress. His words, however, are still worth problematizing. Hansen in this section chooses to recenter whiteness and white responsibility. For Hansen, in a racially just world, Black activists would not exist. This world is not due to the success of the Black liberation movement, but white allies taking responsibility to end all forms of white violence and self-correcting their racist beliefs and behaviors. Hansen's line of argument redirects and depoliticizes what occurred in the Gator incident into a surprising act from an unruly child. What if readers refuse to adopt Hansen's claim and revision some of what Elo wrote? So here it is again. Again, he relays to Vasco that the Gator incident was a well-planned attack by the BSU publicly for publicity. Elo also believes that the fight was an orchestrated move to push Black fence-sitters to its more militant side. He writes that the BSU thought an incident such as this would turn white against all Negroes, and that the moderates in the BSU would be polarized to the extremist fringe simply from white pressure on all Negroes on campus. Unknowingly, Elo's overly biting commentary on the Gator incident, as someone who puts himself in opposition to Vasco and the BSU's ideological stances, lends itself to radical reframing. The BSU is not helpless and is not looking for white saviors to dismantle the institution from within. Duro and Hansen scold white audiences for deploring violence. At the same time, the Black orchestrators of the Gator incident did not see the use of bodily violence as a matter up for debate in the November 6th brawl. So now I will turn to my research questions, and very briefly, because this is a work in progress, I discuss my findings, or like my responses to these questions so far. Again, my first research question is, what depictions of the actors involved in the Gator incident appeared in the publication? I argue, and I'm starting to argue, argue that, you know, it was negative, and at times histrionic depictions of the actors the writers believe were at fault. So very kind of negative histrionic depictions here. Blame functions not only to align the writer with a certain group, but also to depict a certain group. For example, the BSU is depicted as militant, white-hating bullies, and the Gator is depicted at times as an innocent group just trying to report the news. And as I move on, I will try to avoid that type of binary thinking that I see here and make it a bit more fleshed out. But that's what I got so far. So research question 2. How did those writing on the Gator incident shape the discourse on the tactics the actors used to gain or regain power? So here I argue that they picked sides and blamed or praised a particular group when discussing the Gator incident. This reduced the fight to a who's at fault instead of a why did this happen line of argument. The latter offers room for growth, while the former is fairly stagnant. Okay. All right, and then moving on to my conclusion, because I don't want to just leave you on the Gator incident alone. I want you to understand that this was kind of something that was a series of events that were going on at San Francisco State that led to radical change. So a month later, after the Gator incident, another showcasing of student activism, this time through radical coalition building across racial boundaries, which shake San Francisco State's campus. The BSU and movements against political suspensions would organize a student protest where students rushed the administration building and disrupted the daily activities on campus. They wanted President John Summerskill to agree not to suspend the BSU members charged with the Gator incident and the open process editors as well. As pandemonium ensued, Summerskill decided not to call law enforcement on campus, which went unappreciated by the left and criticized by the right. Vasco adopted more of a bipartisan response in his first editorial. He tells readers he believes that Summerskill prevented a major catastrophe by not calling in city police during Wednesday's riot. He also worked hard to get the BSU not to act violently. Nevertheless, he writes next week, on the 12th of December, after more conversation bubbled up on the issue, that he believes Summerskill should not have to answer to the trustees for the BSU and MAP's actions in the December 6th protests. And that's what I have so far. And thank you so much for.
Wonderful. Thank you so very much, Nkenna. Oh, I'm not on again. Hi, wonderful. Thank you so very much. So as is our custom, I am joined by my capable Associate Director for Faculty who's live with you in the room to field questions on that side. And then I will watch the virtual audience here and we'll turn it to you for questions. Thank you very much for the presentation. I think having the person come up and ask the question or might be easier than you repeating the question so that the at-home audience can hear. All right, so we see, may I take screen privilege and call on our first hand that I see, which is Leslie Frye, who's another one of our fellowship community. Welcome, Leslie, thank you.
All right, Nkenna, thank you so much for this work. It's so smart. I'm really excited about it. I didn't know about this event and I really appreciated the just clarity and precision of your rhetorical analysis and also the how you laid out the really biting critique of white liberalism and white radicalism. And there seems like there's just so much relevance for that in the current moment. I'm really thinking about the collective and kind of growing critiques of anti-Black racism at the U and in other spaces too, and wondering about like what you see, if you could just talk a little bit about what you see as the relevance of this historical research to the contemporary critiques of anti-Black racism, and like not even necessarily protests, but if you have any comments about that.
Yeah, I think that's something that I really do want to think about later on. Like, I think when I was engaging in this dissertation project and doing the research, that I saw a lot of parallels between what was happening in the 1960s to contemporary events. And I definitely wanted to make sure that like the work that I was doing was significant, that people could, be able to apply, these histories to what they're seeing right now. So I definitely see some parallels. Some things that I've kind of thought about in the past are just the idea of like the value of property and property destruction. I don't talk about that so much here, but in a lot of histories that you do see about the 1960s and a lot of narratives that you see now in contemporary events, people tend to hyper focus on destruction of property as a means, to kind of criticize like Black movements and like, people of color movements for some type of like liberation or riots. So that's like one major thing that I do want to flesh out a bit more, because I do see that happening a lot, especially because a lot of people were upset about the December 6th protests and how not only did they go into the administration building, but there was some damage to the campus during that event. And then also like the Gator incident itself is like destruction of like a campus, property or facility. So they went into the newsroom and they destroyed, equipment and scattered papers. So that was also looked as like as an unruly act that should be heavily criticized.
Thanks. I also feel like there's something to be said about the proliferation of bomb threats and threats to BSUs across the country, and like what the relevance of particularly, of the analysis that you're doing, not just of like what happened in this moment, but how you're unpacking and making sense of it. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Leslie. And just because I do see another hand on the virtual audience screen, Professor Edmund Fung, a colleague of ours from this College of Social Transformation and Cultural Transformation. Anyway, Professor Edmund Fung, please, your question.
Okay. Hi, Eric. Thanks, Erica. Great talk. Kind of really fascinating. This subject and this time period, especially, is really sort of near and dear to us in ethnic studies. I mean, obviously, as you know, right, ethnic studies would be born, or the movement for ethnic studies would be born in 1968, 1969. So that's kind of at SF State and then also at Berkeley. So that's kind of the nature of my question. One is, kind of how do you sort of see this event, the Gator incident, related to, kind of the broader sort of militant sort of actions that were going on at that time, especially with regard to, sort of the movement to push forward kind of ethnic studies, or at least, in the framing of a third world, student strike. So anything on that would be really fascinating. And I think this is more of a, not a question, but more of a comment. It's just this, this really takes us back to just how different it was back then, right? The sort of militancy of students and sort of the kind of the intensity, right? Of the sort of conversations going on there. And so that's just kind of really eye-opening in many ways. So, but thank you again.
Cool, thank you so much. And I'm excited to talk a little bit more about the historical events. And I got some great feedback from my fellow colleagues here in the Tanner Humanities Center about adding a contextual chapter so people can understand the longer history that occurred. So after the Gator incident, there was a protest to stop the suspensions of the people who were involved in the Gator incident, along with another competing campus publication called Open Process that was a bit more kind of risque. They had published something in there that I think was considered lewd, kind of overly sexual material. And somebody who had some type of influence, who maybe was an alum of the school, decided to kind of rally against these students and get them expelled by calling to, I think the state legislature to like get the president to, suspend these students. So a lot of people were upset about the like political suspensions that were happening, hence, movement against political suspensions. and they decided to protest December 6th, which was a month after the Gator incident. And from that, there were some major actors that were coming about. One person who I've really been trying to investigate more and research more is George Mason Murray. He was a grad student in the English department, and he taught first-year composition classes at San Francisco State. And he was also, in 1968, the Minister of Education for the Black Panther Party. So he was giving a lot of these anti-American, anti-war speeches across the nation and also in Cuba. And again, the state legislature got involved and said, you have to remove Murray from his teaching post as a composition teacher. And there's a lot of uproar in 1968. You see a lot of the headlines for the Gator kind of like following what was going on with George Mason Murray. And a Third World Liberation Front formed kind of multi-ethnic coalition to ask for a Black Studies program, to ask for a School of Ethnic Studies, and also they asked for Murray not to be suspended and to keep his post as a composition teacher and someone who was also teaching at the experimental school. So all of this was happening, and the state legislature would not back down. The board of trustees would not back down. So they fired Murray, and they did not meet enough demands for the strike not to occur. So then you have the Third World Liberation Front strike occurring in 1968 and ending after, like, I think there was Robert Smith, who was the president, and then S.I. Hayakawa was the president as well of San Francisco State. And it ended with him, where he met some of their demands. And if you want to learn more about the history, it's been really interesting to learn more. Reading from scholars like Martha Biondi and Fabio Rojas really inspired me to dig deep into the Gator incident, take a step back from the Third World Liberation Front strike and look at what occurred right before it. And I also want to give a shout out to someone who may not be attending this presentation, but is in the School of Ethnic Studies or Transform, Darius Bost. He was kind enough to do an independent study with me where I read Rojas and Biondi and some other history of education folks, and his patience and kindness to do that independent study definitely shaped my project.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, that follows up a question. Do you plan on interviewing any contemporaries at the time? They're still around, right? I was at an event a couple of years ago with some Asian American activists who were students at SF State at that time, and they were all reflecting upon those kind of crazy years. So yeah, I'm wondering if you imagine that being part of this project, trying to track down or interview people who were participants or on campus at that time. So
yeah, that's, I think, the million-dollar question. Also, it's heart-wrenching because I know that sadly the time is ticking here. This transpired in like the late 1960s, so if I don't ask now, I might never have a chance to talk to some of these folks. But also I want to stay true to the method I'm doing right now, which is more archival and just looking at what was written back then and what was, published back then, and having that be what I work off of rather than histories and narratives that may have changed over the decades. But yeah, for example, someone I talked about, George Mason Murray, is still alive. He's I think reverend in Oakland, and there are parts of me that want to figure out how can I reach out to him. I'm not talking necessarily about the Gator incident or the Liberation Front strike, which I heard that he doesn't like to talk about anymore. I would really love to, just talk to him about what was like being a Black compositionist on campus in the 1960s, just as someone who's been writing rhetoric studies. So, I definitely think maybe I shouldn't wait too long, but I might have to hold off a little bit so I can just kind of focus on one thing here. Thank you so much for these questions.
Yeah, I would and then I'll turn it over to the room because I know we've been doing a lot. This is a comment and a congratulations and to thank you for this. I think one of the important moves you have made in this work is not focusing on the who is to blame or explaining why that's problematic and the why did this happen larger question. Because again, First Amendment, it's freedom of press, it just the optics are terrible. You're trying to shut down free speech. So to bring this into a conversation about why is there this kind of reaction, there's a distinction between words and fists, which is captured in your title. So I would just encourage you to continue to pursue this. Why did this happen? Why did this happen? Because the rhetoric around what a press is saying and what is being communicated through conduct really is illuminating. So thank you for that.
I am thinking. Sometimes
I'm not sure why this is, but the sound is actually strange. It was working for Nkenna.
Okay, can you hear me? Can you hear me here? Okay, so anyway, my question, there are questions. One is like, one of the concepts I'm thinking about here, and it is sort of germane, getting in both ways, especially germane, higher education for Black people, for really getting our education to 1965, 66, was it you literally could one day the number of students so part of it, in some ways it began in a set of questions that was rather this is what you do as institutions that are historically admitting more the ways in which for a lot of brothers that we just continue doing all these and everybody else has to sign on. So there's that really much there. And the Cal State system is a perfect place to tell that. So I think that context that almost or it's been really set up to a access of education for all. And so you have a whole series of things that are coming together and they make that incredibly interesting place. The other context I was mentioned briefly that I didn't talk about it in the presentation was that articulate things and let others do business. I think I have a phenomenal and what matters is and they also resonates about the boundaries of speech, comedy, liberalism, illiberalism, and whether or not violence is ever permissible. And in any event, I felt that question. This is a moment where people want to talk about backlash. That person who says, I hope that guys are liberalism doesn't kill us all. Right? Because there's still like backlash. And then one of the says, yes, have you hated this situation? In the context, it's your last word, it's really serious because they're like conversation of higher education. And that's just phenomenal. So I guess since it didn't come up in as much as I want, I think it's just phenomenal. I love your reflections.
Oh, now you're sounding like you're underwater too. I don't know what happened, but those of us who are on Zoom, if you enable your live transcript function, we do have that operating.
Open some tech device.
Okay, he's trying something. The internal mic.
Oh.
I don't know why. There's a mic and his webcam.
I think it's actually better now.
Is it better?
Yeah.
Yay. Okay, great. You can hear me. Okay. So Jim provided some great feedback and commentary, and to condense his, his feedback and commentary to the question that he posed, he wanted to know more about the student letters that I kind of discovered in the archives and what I thought about those. And it was interesting because when I approached this topic, I thought, okay, I'm going to find a nice body of writing from Black students and, you know, campus community members that I can use and analyze to talk about the Gator incident. I went to archives and realized those do not exist, you know, and you just have the Gator article that says, well, Jamie Garrett, the president of the BSU, says that they weren't involved, and that's basically it. So there are no letters to the editor. There are no think pieces, op-eds that the Gator published anyway, or that I can find on San Francisco State's digital archives that have writing from Black students. So I looked at specifically white, you know, mostly white students responding to the Gator incident. And like Jim was pointing out, that it was like a series of divisive opinions that talk about people who are silent in the wake of something that, you know, tremendous has happened, some type of social event, and they're not doing anything about it. They're just sitting on the fence, not willing to take a side. There are people who are using very bombastic language that you might find nowadays in a comment section, or with the very kind of like hyperbolic, you know, politics that we have right now. You might find this like in certain news media. There's one person who I wasn't able to like include in this talk or even in my dissertation chapter, who just kind of uses all caps throughout the throughout the letter. So he's just kind of screaming at the audience. And I'm like, oh, this somehow like resonates. Like I see what's going on here because it goes on now in 2022. There are people who definitely use a lot of I statements. They try to position themselves, you know, in relationship to some type of like political ideology or stance, you know, that will say, for example, that I'm very anti-war, but I can't condone this. So you see a lot of that stuff. You also see like how people can express their opinions very concisely. And you can also see sometimes gaps in logic, like I've kind of pointed out sometimes too, where he uses very abrasive language, but you're trying to make a very soft point. So it was really a journey and a fun one, you know, at times to just look through all these Gator articles and figure out which ones really pertain to the Gator incident and which ones are really using language in a very artful way that says something about why the Gator incident was important.
Okay, hi everyone. I'm Jeremy Rosen, for those of you who don't know me, from English and Associate Director for Faculty. I just want to echo what so many have said. I mean, I think this is just such a fascinating and like eerily and unfortunately relevant, and so much of the discourse really does seem like we're still there. I mean, there's one of the students who says something like, why doesn't the editor just apologize for being white?
Yeah.
Like as if all critiques of social inequity are like trying to make white people feel bad. And that's still like so much of like the account of what critical race theory is like meant to do, right? Like make people feel guilty. And I think, you know, what I wanted to ask you about kind of takes off of, I think, both of Jim's comment and Edmund's, which are to say that this is such a kind of profound moment of, I think, institutional change and conflict, and you know, the movement to integrate, but also change the curriculum, right? To change the university from within by adding new disciplines. And I guess my question is kind of a methodological one, which is in literary studies now, there's kind of a movement towards institutional critique, which is not to just sort of think about texts and what they're saying and how they work as objects, but to think about the institutions through which they're produced, disseminated, and consumed. And it seems to me like another way this is such an interesting story is because it sort of takes place over the means of production of discourse. It it is a literal fight at the source of the press. And so, one way of thinking about, I think the action by the BSU or allegedly by the BSU is to think of it as a response to a sort of lack of control of the discursive machinery, and that violence or protest becomes an answer when you don't have a microphone. And so I guess, my question is maybe sort of twofold. Like, one, to what extent is like that kind of institutional critique something that you want to, is a kind of thinking about the context around the discourse that you're analyzing. And I think, like people said, the discourse analysis piece is already great. And, sort of, secondly, along with, do you want to think about the sort of this discursive and institutional power dynamics and framework? What was my second question? Well, maybe we'll just stop there.
Okay.
Thanks.
All right, well, thank you for the question. Yeah, I think there's so much I really want to do with this project concerning contextualizing it, and also thinking, taking a step back and thinking about the institutional structures that exist that allow, this event to occur and the aftermath to occur. So yeah, there was a lot going on with, as Jim said, like the CAL systems, and University of California, that I just really do want to take time to really think about. But yeah, like the institution itself, San Francisco State, they had the Gator, they had some other competing publications like Open Process, and there was a lot of dissatisfaction with the Gator reporting that people do point out, whether or not they're on the side of the BSU. They talk about yellow journalism, they talk about the lack of objectivity, they talk about how the reporting that the Gator is doing doesn't kind of allow for positive images of Black people and Black community members and Black students, that they're getting the activism that's going on campus wrong. And I position like my paper as seeing the Gator as some type of institutional representative. So I really do want to take time to really examine like what's going on here compared to other campus publications across the US, or just like the competing campus publications at San Francisco State. But yeah, I think there is a part of me that really, as I keep working on this dissertation project, needs to take a step back. I talked to my chair, Maureen, about it. Just like I'm very microscopic and I'm very methodical with the analysis, but I really need to take a step back and think about the institutional structures, think about the theory that's involved, think about contextualizing everything that I'm seeing. And yeah, that's the next step.
Well, I was just going to say, oh, hey, Maureen. Maureen was a former Tanner Humanities Fellow. I don't see any more Zoom little hands, so I turn it back.
Hello, my name is Charnel. I'm also a fellow in communication. And I'm kind of wondering about, and you just talked about kind of the things that you're wanting to do with context and kind of conceptualization. And so I'm thinking about like how you have like the action that's happening, and this is kind of in the title with like the words and the fight, like the physical fight. So you have like the discourse of the newspapers, and you also have like the actions that are taking place, like the disciplinary actions, the policy from the institutions. At the same time, this is like a material, like the actual newspaper is a material. So I'm wondering from your perspective, like as you're analyzing, are you seeing the discourse from these letters to the editor as material, as action, as purely symbolic, or kind of what are the relationship between those things?
Thank you, Sarnell, for such a wonderful question. Yeah, I do talk about briefly in the chapter that I feel like the words of these students have power, and power, yeah, I want to recognize the materiality of the paper itself. I'm also thinking about how do I talk about the words that are featured in the paper and the power that they have as something that isn't material, but is very kind of highly theoretical and leads to action and change. I don't know, like I am struggling a bit with that question. But yeah, I get what you're saying here, that I do want to really think more about the words as being more than just words here, and recognizing the fact that that these kind of words kind of inspire some type of like public sphere type of discourse that's occurring with different types of writers and readers, that does kind of lead to like material change and action. You know, the words that they are saying, you know, is something that may lead people to take some type of course of action, or to kind of revisit their line of thinking or logic about a certain like issue that, you know, is specific to San Francisco State or in a larger kind of overarching issue. So I was kind of jumbled up, but I think that's kind of what I have right now.
I'm just going to jump in again because I happen to be teaching First Amendment this semester, and there is a doctrine called fighting words, words that by their very utterance inflict injury. It's fallen out of the favor, but in the mid-century and prior to the 60s, around the MacArthur, the Red Scare. So while speech has become more protected, there were kernels of some justices who realized that words do have the power of fists, and that fighting words are going to incite, and you'll have hostile audience reactions, and move back from regulating that kind of speech precisely because words are so powerful. So it's interesting to see this play out. You mentioned that there was a transition from the assailants in the newsroom being blamed or thought of as wholly criminalized to something more sympathetic. Can you say more about how that occurred?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit more about that. So I think maybe it was campus climate changing during the 1960s, particularly 68 and 69, but also a change in editors. So he moved from Vasco, stepping down, I think after he graduated in February 68. And also, I think a lot of people, or a few people at the Gator were unhappy with the way that the aftermath of the Gator incident transpired. So from what I've read, some people who were a part of the Gator when Vasco was editor stepped down and decided not to be a part of the paper. So I think, you know, the kind of turning over of the staff, the campus climate at the time that was more, you know, open to protests and different types of like calls to action and ways of, you know, trying to create change, whether it's protests or strikes, meant that the Gator was kind of transforming, radically shifting closer to the left. So you have new editors, featuring the Black Student Union and the Third World Liberation Front more in the paper, and also the presence of task force and the police also kind of gained sympathy for the BSU and for protesters as well, because there are these images that are occurring in the 1968 and 69 editions of the Gator, where you see photos of a protester lying on the ground and being beaten with a club or other paraphernalia that police officers have during these protests. And this large argument, you know, controversy going on about like whether police should be on campus and whether they should be used to enforce some type of like civility or, you know, on campus. So I think that's probably like two major reasons why you're seeing this shift happening, just the internal shift in the Gator, and then also the presence of like an even kind of scarier or fearsome force, the police, you know, going in and attacking students during these protests. Cool. Well, any other questions? I don't think there are any questions in the room. Oh, you're on mute, Erica.
Oh, okay. I was saying, oh, okay. If that is the case, then I have the fortunate task of congratulating you and thanking you. Please join me in the room in congratulating Nkenna. And I will announce our next work in progress will be Helga Schuttgart from the Communications Department. She's presenting on Tuesday, March 22nd. So be on the lookout for that. We hope you will join us. And then later in the month in our public programming series, we will be welcoming the writer and playwright author Ayat Akhtar. So he will join us on March 29th in the evening, and there'll be a smaller conversation with him the following morning on March 30th. So watch your inboxes, watch our website, and please follow us on social media and share about the wonderful fellows we have and the work that they're doing. Thank you all so very much, and we look forward to seeing you again next week. Nkenna, congratulations.